I sat at our family's Thanksgiving table, cutting through my slice of turkey, while my sister Jessica launched into another lecture about my pathetic financial choices. "Still playing with your little investments, Charles?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension as she gestured toward me with her wine glass. The entire family chuckled knowingly. My parents exchanged those familiar looks. My brother-in-law Marcus shook his head with amusement, and even the kids snickered from their end of the table. I simply continued chewing, savoring both the perfectly seasoned meat and the secret I carried. Jessica had no idea what was coming. Her confident smile widened as she began boasting about her executive position at Megatech Corporation and her million-dollar stock portfolio. Then, Emma, her personal assistant, burst through our dining room door's cell phone, clutched in her trembling hand, face drained of all color. "Ma'am." Emma gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "Your major shareholder, Peterson Holdings, just dumped $320 million in shares. The stock is plummeting." My name is Charles Morrison, and I have spent 32 years living in the shadow of my older sister Jessica. As an investment analyst specializing in forensic accounting, I have learned to see patterns that others miss, to question numbers that seem too perfect, and to remain calm when markets panic. But none of that mattered to my family, who saw only Jessica's corner office, her company Tesla, and her seemingly endless success at Megatech Corporation. 3 hours before Emma's dramatic entrance, I had arrived at my parents' colonial home in Westport, Connecticut, carrying a bottle of wine and the weight of knowledge that would soon change everything. The house buzzed with familiar energy as my mother Linda fussed over the turkey, while my father Robert argued with the television about football scores. Jessica had arrived earlier in her gleaming black Model S, immediately commandeering the conversation, with stories about her latest promotion to senior vice president. "Charles, honey, tell everyone about your new apartment," my mother suggested as we gathered around the mahogany table that had hosted 23 years of family celebrations. I mentioned my modest one-bedroom place in Stamford, which prompted Jessica to launch into detailed descriptions of the waterfront condo she was purchasing in Greenwich. "The down payment alone is more than Charles makes in a year," she announced, causing my brother-in-law Marcus to whistle appreciatively. Marcus, a successful cardiologist, had always admired Jessica's corporate achievements. Their children, 17-year-old Tyler and 15-year-old Madison, barely looked up from their phones as Jessica detailed her compensation package. For months, I had been quietly building a massive position against Megatech through put options and short selling. My research had uncovered disturbing patterns in their financial statements: revenue recognition, irregularities, suspicious timing of acquisitions, and insider trading activity that preceded every major announcement. But explaining derivative strategies to my family felt like discussing quantum physics with kindergartners. "Charles still drives that ancient Honda Civic." Jessica continued, pointing toward the window where my 10-year-old car sat next to her Tesla. "I keep telling him that image matters in business, but he refuses to listen." The family nodded sympathetically, as if my transportation choices represented some tragic character flaw. During the salad course, Jessica regaled us with tales of her upcoming promotion to executive vice president, a position that would make her the youngest person ever to reach that level at Megatech. She described her expanding team, her influence over company strategy, and her stock options that would vest next month. Every detail reinforced the family narrative that Jessica was the successful child, while I remained the cautious underachiever. "Robert, show Charles the article about Jessica in Business Weekly," my mother urged. My father proudly produced a magazine featuring a photograph of Jessica at some corporate event surrounded by other executives in expensive suits. "They called her one of the rising stars in technology," he beamed. As we moved to the main course, Jessica shifted her attention to my investment philosophy. "Charles thinks he can beat the market by reading boring financial reports," she laughed. "Meanwhile, I am the market. I help create the growth that generates the returns he is trying to capture." The family absorbed this wisdom, as if she had revealed some profound truth about modern economics. I continued eating methodically, calculating the potential magnitude of what was about to unfold. 3 months earlier, I had discovered that Peterson Holdings, Megatech's largest institutional investor, had been quietly reducing their position while publicly maintaining their support. Their SEC filings revealed growing concerns about accounting practices and acquisition strategies. But Jessica lived inside the corporate bubble, surrounded by colleagues who shared her optimism and bonus-driven enthusiasm. "Emma should be here soon," Jessica announced, checking her diamond-studded watch. "I asked her to stop by with some documents for Monday's board presentation. You will get to meet a real professional, Charles. She graduated from Columbia Business School and manages my entire schedule." The irony was not lost on me. Emma was about to deliver news that would shatter Jessica's carefully constructed world, and she had no idea that her personal assistant was racing through Connecticut traffic with information that would change everything. As if summoned by Jessica's words, Emma Martinez appeared in our dining room doorway, her usually perfect appearance disheveled from running. Her brown eyes were wide with panic, and her hands shook as she approached Jessica with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am, I apologize for interrupting your family dinner." Emma began, her voice barely steady. "But Peterson Holdings just filed their 13D form. They are selling their entire position in Megatech. $320 million worth of shares hit the market 15 minutes ago." Jessica's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. For the first time in years, I watched my sister's confidence waver as she processed information that did not fit her carefully constructed narrative about Megatech's inevitable success. The silence that followed Emma's announcement felt heavier than the Connecticut snow beginning to fall outside our dining room windows. Jessica's face cycled through confusion, denial, and the first flickerings of genuine fear as the implications began penetrating her corporate-trained optimism. "That cannot be right," Jessica stammered, setting down her wine glass with trembling fingers. "Peterson Holdings has been our strongest supporter for 3 years. They increased their position just last quarter." She fumbled for her phone, her manicured nails clicking frantically against the screen as she searched for market data. Marcus leaned forward with the focused attention he typically reserved for cardiac emergencies. "What exactly does this mean, Jessica?" He asked, his medical training demanding clear diagnosis of the situation. Before Jessica could respond, I found myself explaining institutional selling dynamics with the calm precision that had served me well throughout my analytical career. When major shareholders liquidate positions this large, it typically signals serious concerns about fundamental business problems, I said quietly. Other institutions often follow, creating cascading selling pressure. "Charles is right," Emma added reluctantly, consulting her phone for real-time market data. "The stock has dropped 12% in after-hours trading. CNBC is already running breaking news alerts about unusual trading volume." Jessica's professional facade began cracking as she processed this assault on her worldview. "This is temporary market volatility," she insisted, though her voice lacked its usual commanding tone. "Megatech's fundamentals remain incredibly strong. Peterson Holdings obviously has weak hands and cannot handle normal market fluctuations." My mother, who had been quietly clearing salad plates, stopped to ask the question everyone was thinking. "Jessica, honey, how much of your money is tied up in company stock?" The inquiry hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. "That information is confidential," Jessica replied sharply, though her deflection revealed more than any specific number could have. Throughout dinner, she had bragged about maximizing her exposure to Megatech's growth through stock options, employee stock purchase programs, and personal investments. Now those same positions represented potential catastrophe rather than guaranteed wealth. While Jessica made frantic phone calls to colleagues, I quietly researched Peterson Holdings' SEC filing on my smartphone. The institutional investor had cited material concerns about accounting practices and acquisition integration as their primary reason for divesting. These were exactly the issues I had identified during my 6-month investigation into Megatech's suspicious financial patterns. My father, who had spent 40 years managing a successful accounting firm, began asking technical questions that demonstrated his growing understanding of the situation's severity. Charles, when institutional investors cite accounting concerns, what specific problems are they typically identifying? His question represented the first time he had sought my professional opinion about anything significant. I explained revenue recognition irregularities, particularly around Megatech's aggressive acquisition strategy. Companies sometimes purchase smaller firms at inflated prices, then immediately write down the assets while reporting the acquisitions as organic growth drivers, I said. It creates an illusion of expansion while actually destroying shareholder value. Jessica overheard this explanation while waiting for her calls to connect. Charles, you have no idea what you are talking about, she snapped. You analyze companies from the outside, reading stale public filings. I work inside Megatech. I see the real numbers, the real strategy, the real growth potential. But her conviction seemed forced, now lacking the effortless superiority she had displayed just minutes earlier. Tyler and Madison, sensing adult tension they could not fully comprehend, retreated to the family room with their dessert plates. Emma received another phone call that further darkened the evening's trajectory. After a whispered conversation, she approached Jessica with obvious reluctance. Ma'am, that was Jake from Investor Relations. 3 major financial publications are preparing investigative articles about Megatech's accounting practices. They plan to publish tomorrow morning before market open. The news hit Jessica like physical impact. She gripped the edge of the dining table, her knuckles whitening as she processed the implications of coordinated negative media coverage coinciding with institutional selling pressure. This is obviously a coordinated attack by short sellers, she declared, though her voice carried doubt rather than conviction. They are trying to manipulate the stock price through manufactured controversy and media manipulation. Marcus, who had been silently observing the unfolding drama, finally spoke with the directness that made him an excellent surgeon. Jessica, setting aside your emotional investment in the company, what does your rational analysis tell you about this situation? For the first time in years, Jessica looked genuinely uncertain. Her corporate training had prepared her for managing teams, developing strategies, and navigating office politics. But she had no framework for processing the possibility that her employer might be fundamentally flawed, and her financial security might be evaporating in real time. Emma's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen with growing alarm. Ma'am, I am receiving messages from multiple colleagues asking about the Peterson Holdings news. Word is spreading quickly through the company. As if to emphasize the point, Jessica's own phone began ringing with calls from friends, colleagues, and contacts throughout the technology industry. Each conversation revealed additional layers of concern and confusion as Megatech's crisis deepened with each passing hour. The living room became a makeshift war room, as Jessica commandeered the large television to monitor financial news networks. CNBC, Bloomberg, and Fox Business were all covering Megatech's after-hours collapse with the breathless intensity usually reserved for major economic disasters. Shares of Megatech Corporation are down 18% in extended trading, following news that Peterson Holdings has liquidated their entire $320 million position, announced a blonde reporter standing outside the New York Stock Exchange. This represents the largest single-day institutional selling event in the company's history. My mother, Linda, who typically avoided financial programming, found herself mesmerized by the scrolling ticker displaying Megatech's plummeting share price. Jessica, sweetheart, help me understand something, she said gently. If the stock keeps falling, what happens to your retirement savings? The question struck at the heart of Jessica's vulnerability. Throughout her corporate career, she had maximized her exposure to Megatech's growth by concentrating her investments rather than diversifying. Her 401k, her personal trading account, and her unvested stock options were all tied to the company's performance. "Mom, this is temporary market irrationality," Jessica replied, though her voice carried less conviction than before. Megatech has incredible technology, strong market position, and experienced leadership. Smart money will recognize this as a buying opportunity. But as she spoke, Emma received yet another phone call that further undermined Jessica's optimistic narrative. "Ma'am, that was Sarah from Executive Communications. The Chief Financial Officer just submitted his resignation effective immediately. He cited personal reasons, but the timing is obviously concerning. I understood the significance of this development, even if the rest of my family did not. Chief Financial Officers do not resign without warning unless they have knowledge of serious problems that could result in personal liability." Thomas Chen had been Megatech's CFO for 4 years, overseeing the acquisition strategy that had driven the company's growth narrative. "Thomas is probably just taking a better opportunity elsewhere," Jessica said weakly. "CFOs at his level receive recruiting calls constantly." But her explanation sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Marcus, whose medical training had taught him to recognize symptoms of systemic failure, began asking pointed questions about Megatech's financial health. "Jessica, when you review the company's quarterly reports, do the numbers seem consistent with your daily operational experience?" The question forced Jessica to confront details she had previously ignored. "Well, our revenue growth has been impressive, but it comes mainly from acquisitions rather than organic expansion," she admitted reluctantly. "And integration has been more challenging than management initially projected." While my family grappled with these revelations, I quietly reflected on the extensive research that had led me to bet against Megatech. 6 months earlier, I had begun investigating the company after noticing irregularities in their acquisition accounting. Small technology firms were being purchased at prices that seemed disconnected from their actual revenue potential. My analysis had revealed a pattern of financial engineering designed to create an illusion of growth while obscuring fundamental operational weaknesses. Megatech would acquire companies for inflated prices, immediately write down the assets, but report the revenue from these acquisitions as evidence of organic expansion. The strategy worked as long as investors focused on top-line growth rather than operational efficiency. Emma's phone continued buzzing with updates from Megatech employees, each message adding another layer of concern. "Ma'am, people are asking whether Monday's board meeting will address the Peterson Holdings situation. There are rumors about emergency sessions with external auditors. Those are just precautionary measures," Jessica insisted, though her certainty continued eroding. "Every public company maintains relationships with auditing firms. Having discussions with external advisors demonstrates responsible corporate governance." But Robert, whose accounting background gave him insight into corporate crisis management, recognized the implications of emergency auditor meetings. "Jessica, companies do not call weekend sessions with auditors unless they have identified serious problems that require immediate attention." As evening turned to night, Jessica's phone calls became increasingly desperate. Colleagues who normally returned her messages immediately were suddenly unavailable. Her supervisor was in emergency meetings. Her contacts in investor relations were not responding to texts. Tyler wandered back into the living room, drawn by the unusual tension and constant phone activity. "Mom, is Aunt Jessica going to be okay?" he asked Marcus, quietly, sensing adult worry that exceeded normal family drama. The question highlighted the broader implications of Megatech's crisis. Jessica was not just facing professional embarrassment or temporary financial losses. Her entire identity had been built around corporate success, and that foundation was crumbling in real time. I found myself feeling genuine sympathy for my sister, despite years of condescension and mockery. She had believed in her company, trusted her colleagues, and followed conventional wisdom about concentrating investments in familiar businesses. Her mistakes were understandable, even if the consequences were devastating. Emma received one final phone call that evening, and her expression suggested the news was worse than anything they had heard previously. She approached Jessica with obvious reluctance, clearly wishing she could avoid delivering another devastating update. "Ma'am, I just spoke with David from Legal Compliance. The Securities and Exchange Commission contacted the company about opening a formal investigation into financial reporting practices. They want to review all acquisition-related accounting from the past 18 months. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of federal investigation. SEC inquiries often preceded criminal charges, shareholder lawsuits, and executive prosecutions. Jessica's career was not just threatened by stock price volatility. She might face legal consequences for practices she had assumed were standard corporate strategy. For the first time since Emma's arrival, Jessica looked directly at me with something approaching humility. "Charles, you seem to understand these situations better than I realized. What exactly does an SEC investigation typically involve?" Her question represented a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamics. After years of dismissing my expertise, Jessica was finally acknowledging that I might possess knowledge that could help her navigate this crisis. I chose my words carefully, knowing that Jessica's emotional state made her vulnerable to both hope and despair. SEC investigations typically examine whether companies have misled investors through financial statements, press releases, or executive communications, I explained. They review internal documents, interview employees, and compare public statements to private communications. Jessica's face went pale as she considered the implications. "But we always followed legal and accounting guidelines," she protested weakly. "Everything was reviewed by compliance teams and external auditors." Emma, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up with information that complicated Jessica's defense. "Ma'am, do you remember the acquisitions committee meetings, where executives discussed optimizing revenue recognition timing? Some of those conversations might be problematic if reviewed by federal investigators." The revelation hit Jessica like a physical blow. She had participated in strategy sessions that, while technically legal, might appear manipulative when examined by skeptical regulators. The difference between aggressive accounting and fraudulent reporting often depended on intent and context, rather than specific rules. My father, whose decades of experience with corporate audits gave him insight into regulatory processes, asked the question everyone was avoiding. "Jessica, do you think company executives knew about potential accounting problems, but failed to disclose them properly?" "I honestly do not know anymore," Jessica admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believed everything management told us about growth strategies and acquisition synergies. If they were misleading shareholders, they were misleading employees too." Marcus, who had been silently processing the unfolding crisis, finally addressed the practical implications. "Jessica, we need to discuss your financial exposure and potential legal liability. This situation could affect not just your career, but your personal assets and future opportunities." While my family grappled with these revelations, I reflected on the research network that had enabled my successful analysis of Megatech's problems. Independent financial analysts, former employees, and investigative journalists had been sharing information about questionable corporate practices across multiple companies. Megatech represented just one example of systematic problems in how technology companies reported growth and managed investor expectations. "Charles," my mother said quietly, "you seem to have understood these problems before they became obvious. How did you know to investigate Megatech when everyone else thought the company was successful?" I explained my analytical approach, emphasizing pattern recognition and forensic accounting techniques that most investors ignored. When companies grow primarily through acquisitions rather than organic expansion, it often signals underlying operational weaknesses, I said. Healthy businesses typically grow by serving more customers or developing better products, not by purchasing competitors at inflated prices. Jessica listened with growing attention, finally recognizing that my methodical research approach had identified problems that her insider perspective had obscured. I was so focused on our internal metrics and growth targets that I never questioned whether our strategy was sustainable," she admitted. Emma's phone buzzed with another update that deepened the crisis. "Ma'am, I am receiving reports that 3 other major institutional investors are planning to reduce their megatech positions based on the Peterson Holdings disclosure. The selling pressure could intensify significantly when markets open Monday." The news prompted Jessica to ask questions she had been avoiding throughout the evening. "Charles, if the stock continues falling, how low could it realistically go, and how long might it take to recover?" I answered with the honesty that Jessica needed to hear, rather than the optimism she wanted to receive. When fundamental business problems combine with regulatory investigation and institutional selling pressure, stocks can decline 70 to 80% from peak levels. Recovery, if it happens at all, typically takes years rather than months. The magnitude of potential losses finally registered with Jessica. Her stock options, which had been worth nearly $2 million that morning, could become worthless. Her employee stock purchase plan contributions could disappear. Her retirement savings concentrated in megatech shares could shrink to a fraction of their previous value. "I feel like such an idiot," Jessica said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I mocked your careful investment approach while making every mistake you warned people about. I concentrated my investments, ignored red flags, and believed corporate marketing instead of independent analysis." Her admission represented a breakthrough in our relationship that transcended the immediate crisis. For the first time in years, Jessica was acknowledging my expertise while recognizing her own limitations. Tyler and Madison, who had been hiding in the family room, appeared in the doorway with obvious concern about their aunt's emotional state. "Is everything going to be okay?" Madison asked innocently, unaware of the financial catastrophe unfolding around them. Jessica composed herself enough to provide reassurance, while avoiding false promises. "Things are complicated right now, sweetie, but families support each other through difficult times. Uncle Charles is helping me understand options for dealing with these problems." The statement acknowledged a role reversal that would have been unthinkable 12 hours earlier. Jessica, who had spent years positioning herself as the family's financial expert, was now seeking guidance from the brother she had consistently dismissed. Emma received one final phone call that evening, and her expression suggested the news would fundamentally change Monday's corporate landscape. "Ma'am, Bloomberg is reporting that federal investigators have been interviewing former megatech employees for several weeks. This investigation appears much more advanced than anyone realized." The revelation that federal authorities had been building a case while megatech stock reached record highs demonstrated how thoroughly Jessica had been insulated from reality by corporate culture and personal financial interest. The same optimism that had driven her professional success had blinded her to obvious warning signs. As we prepared to end this devastating Thanksgiving evening, Jessica asked me the question that would define our future relationship. "Charles, despite everything I have said about your investment approach, would you be willing to help me understand how to protect whatever assets I have left?" Her request represented complete acknowledgement that my analytical skills and independent perspective offered value that her corporate connections could not provide. For the first time in our adult lives, Jessica was treating me as an equal rather than a subordinate. When I woke up Friday morning, financial markets were already reacting to overnight developments in the megatech story. Asian markets had opened with significant selling pressure in technology stocks, and European investors were dumping shares of companies with similar business models. The crisis was spreading beyond a single corporate disaster into broader questions about accounting practices across the entire sector. My phone had 17 missed calls from Jessica, who had apparently spent the night monitoring news coverage and researching her legal and financial options. When I returned her call, her voice carried exhaustion and barely controlled panic. "Charles, the Securities and Exchange Commission just announced a formal investigation into Megatech's financial reporting practices. They are specifically examining acquisition accounting and revenue recognition over the past 3 years," she said without preamble. The stock is down another 25% in pre-market trading. I drove to Jessica's condo in Greenwich to help her assess the damage and develop a strategy for protecting her remaining assets. The waterfront property she had been so proud of suddenly seemed like another liability rather than a symbol of success. Her mortgage payments, car loans, and credit card balances had been manageable when supported by stock options worth $2 million. Now those same obligations threatened to overwhelm her shrinking resources. I received a call from Human Resources this morning. Jessica continued as I reviewed her financial statements. They are eliminating my division and offering voluntary severance packages to senior executives. The company wants to distance itself from anyone associated with the acquisition strategy that created these problems. The irony was devastating. Jessica's expertise in managing corporate acquisitions, which had driven her rapid promotion and increasing compensation, now made her a liability. Her knowledge of internal discussions and strategic decisions could make her a target for both federal investigators and civil lawsuits. Marcus arrived with coffee and bagels, treating our strategy session with the same focused attention he brought to surgical planning. Jessica, we need to quantify your total exposure and identify immediate steps for damage control, he said practically. What are your liquid assets, fixed obligations, and potential legal expenses? As we spread Jessica's financial documents across her granite kitchen table, the scope of her vulnerability became clear. 93% of her net worth was tied to Megatech through stock options, employee stock purchases, and personal investments. Her emergency fund contained only enough cash to cover 3 months of expenses. Her 401k was entirely invested in company stock. I followed all the conventional wisdom about believing in your employer and concentrating investments in familiar businesses, Jessica said bitterly. Every financial advisor at Megatech encouraged employees to maximize their exposure to company growth. While Jessica confronted her mistakes, I quietly calculated the profits from my own positions betting against Megatech. My put options and short sales had generated returns exceeding 400% as the stock collapsed. The careful research that my family had dismissed as overly cautious was transforming my modest investment account into substantial wealth. Emma arrived with additional bad news that demonstrated how quickly corporate crises can spiral beyond control. Ma'am, I spoke with colleagues still working at Megatech. The internal investigation has discovered that revenue recognition practices violated generally accepted accounting principles. Several acquisitions were structured specifically to hide losses and inflate growth metrics. The revelation confirmed my analysis, while devastating Jessica's remaining hope for quick recovery. If Megatech had systematically misrepresented its financial performance, the company faced not just regulatory penalties, but massive shareholder lawsuits and potential criminal charges for executives. Charles, I need to ask you something that might sound strange, Jessica said hesitantly. You obviously understood these problems before they became public. Did you position your investments to profit from Megatech's collapse? I answered honestly, knowing that transparency would serve our relationship better than false modesty. Yes, I have been shorting Megatech stock and buying put options since July. My research indicated fundamental problems that made the company's valuation unsustainable. Jessica absorbed this information without resentment, recognizing that my contrarian position represented analytical skill rather than personal betrayal. How much money are we talking about? She asked quietly. Enough to change my life significantly, I replied, but more importantly enough to help family members who might need financial support during difficult transitions. My offer of assistance marked a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamics. Instead of competing for parental approval or professional recognition, we were becoming genuine partners focused on solving practical problems. Marcus, who had been quietly reviewing news coverage on his phone, shared information that expanded the crisis beyond Megatech. Charles Bloomberg is reporting that federal investigators are examining similar patterns at other high-growth technology companies. This could be the beginning of a much broader market correction. His observation aligned with intelligence from my research network, which had identified questionable practices at multiple firms using aggressive acquisition strategies to create illusions of organic growth. Megatech was not an isolated case, but part of systematic problems in how investors evaluated corporate performance. Jessica, I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear, I said carefully. My analysis suggests that Megatech's problems are not temporary setbacks, but fundamental flaws that could destroy the company entirely. You should prepare for the possibility that your stock options will become worthless, and your severance package might be your only significant recovery. Emma, who had been monitoring social media and financial forums throughout the morning, provided additional evidence of deteriorating sentiment. Ma'am, former employees are posting anonymous comments about accounting irregularities and management pressure to meet unrealistic growth targets. These revelations are generating additional negative coverage. As afternoon turned to evening, Jessica finally asked the question I had been expecting. Charles, if you were in my position, what specific steps would you take to minimize damage and protect my family's financial future? Her request for guidance represented complete role reversal from the condescending sister who had mocked my investment philosophy just 24 hours earlier. Now, she was acknowledging that my analytical approach and independent perspective offered practical value that her corporate experience could not provide. I spent the next 2 hours walking Jessica through financial triage, identifying liquid assets, calculating minimum living expenses, evaluating severance options, and developing contingency plans for various scenarios. For the first time in years, our conversation focused on problem solving rather than competition. The most important thing is accepting that your previous financial assumptions are no longer valid, I concluded. Recovery will require building new strategies based on current reality rather than past expectations. Jessica nodded with growing understanding, finally recognizing that successful navigation of this crisis would require the same analytical discipline and emotional objectivity that had enabled my contrarian investment success. 6 weeks after that devastating Thanksgiving evening, the full scope of Megatech's collapse had become clear to everyone except the most optimistic company loyalists. The stock had fallen 84% from its peak, wiping out over $50 billion in market capitalization and destroying the retirement savings of thousands of employees who had concentrated their investments in company shares. Federal investigators had expanded their inquiry to include potential criminal charges against senior executives who had known about accounting irregularities, but failed to disclose them to shareholders. The Securities and Exchange Commission's civil investigation was focusing on whether management had deliberately misled investors through earnings calls, investor presentations, and regulatory filings. Jessica had accepted the voluntary severance package and was transitioning to a compliance officer position at a smaller technology firm that valued her experience with regulatory requirements. The new role paid 60% less than her Megatech salary, but it offered stability and kept her employed while other former executives faced unemployment and legal expenses. I never imagined that my insider knowledge of Megatech's practices would become a liability rather than an asset, Jessica reflected as we reviewed her financial recovery plan. Companies are reluctant to hire executives from firms under federal investigation, regardless of individual culpability. Meanwhile, my successful analysis of Megatech's problems had generated recognition throughout the investment community. Major hedge funds and institutional investors were offering senior analyst positions that would triple my previous salary, while providing opportunities to apply forensic accounting skills to other potentially problematic companies. Charles, I need to apologize for years of dismissing your analytical abilities and treating your investment approach as inferior to my corporate insights, Jessica said during one of our weekly strategy sessions. You understood systematic problems that I completely missed despite working inside the company. Her acknowledgement meant more than any professional recognition or financial gain. For 32 years, I had lived with family dynamics that positioned Jessica as the successful child while treating my careful, methodical approach as evidence of limited ambition. Now, those same analytical skills were generating both financial success and genuine respect. My parents had begun seeking my advice on major financial decisions, finally recognizing that my investment expertise offered practical value for protecting their retirement savings. Robert was particularly interested in learning about forensic accounting techniques that could help identify potential problems before they became obvious to mainstream investors. Son, I realize we may have underestimated your professional capabilities while overestimating the security of corporate employment, my father admitted during a family dinner. Your independent analysis protected you from losses that destroyed people with much higher incomes and seemingly better opportunities. The megatech collapse had triggered broader market awareness about aggressive accounting practices and questionable acquisition strategies. Regulatory agencies were implementing stricter oversight requirements, and investors were becoming more skeptical of companies that grew primarily through purchasing competitors rather than developing superior products or services. Emma, who had found employment managing investor relations for a small biotechnology firm, shared updates about ongoing developments in the megatech investigation. Charles federal prosecutors are considering criminal charges against the former chief financial officer and 3 other executives who participated in meetings where accounting manipulation was discussed explicitly. These revelations confirmed my analysis, while highlighting how thoroughly Jessica had been insulated from the systematic deception that had driven her employer's apparent success. Her participation in acquisition committee meetings could have made her a target for prosecution if investigators believed she had knowledge of fraudulent practices. I am incredibly grateful that you encouraged me to cooperate fully with federal investigators rather than trying to minimize my involvement, Jessica told me. Complete transparency about what I knew and when I knew, it probably protected me from serious legal consequences. My research network continued identifying other companies with similar red flags, and I was positioning my portfolio to profit from their likely declines while helping clients avoid exposure to systematic risks. The analytical framework that had enabled my megatech success was applicable to multiple situations where corporate marketing conflicted with operational reality. Charles, your ability to identify problems before they become obvious has created opportunities that most investors never recognize, Marcus observed. You profit from market inefficiencies while helping people avoid devastating losses. Tyler and Madison, who had been following the megatech story with teenage fascination, were beginning to understand how financial markets reflected broader questions about corporate honesty and individual responsibility. Their aunt's experience provided practical education about risk management and the importance of independent thinking. Uncle Charles, how did you know to investigate megatech when everyone else thought it was a great company? Tyler asked during a family gathering. His question demonstrated genuine interest in analytical thinking rather than just curiosity about financial drama. I explained research methodology and critical thinking skills, emphasizing that successful investing required questioning popular assumptions and following evidence rather than emotion. Markets reward independent analysis and punish groupthink, I concluded. The same principles apply to career decisions, business strategies, and life choices. As winter turned to spring, Jessica had developed a diversified investment portfolio under my guidance, while rebuilding her professional reputation through competent work at her new firm. The experience had taught her humility and practical financial skills that her previous corporate success had not required. I finally understand why you never envied my megatech career, Jessica said thoughtfully. You recognized that my apparent success was built on unstable foundations that could collapse without warning. Your independent position provided both financial security and intellectual freedom. Her insight represented complete transformation from the condescending sister who had mocked my modest lifestyle and careful investment approach. Now she appreciated that true security came from analytical competence and emotional discipline rather than corporate titles and stock option wealth. Emma called with news that brought closure to the most dramatic chapter of our family's financial education. Charles, the Securities and Exchange Commission, just announced that Megatech has agreed to a settlement requiring them to pay $350 million in penalties, while admitting to systematic violations of financial reporting requirements. The settlement validated my analysis, while providing compensation for investors who had relied on the company's misleading statements. More importantly, it demonstrated that careful research and contrarian thinking could identify serious problems that official oversight had missed. As I reflected on the 8 months since that memorable Thanksgiving dinner, I realized that Megatech's collapse had strengthened rather than damaged our family relationships. Shared crisis had replaced competition with cooperation, creating mutual respect based on demonstrated competence rather than assumed hierarchy. Thanksgiving arrived again exactly 1 year after Emma's dramatic announcement had shattered Jessica's confidence and transformed our family's understanding of success failure and the importance of independent thinking. This time, our gathering felt fundamentally different, marked by genuine mutual respect and collaborative problem-solving, rather than competitive status displays and condescending commentary. Jessica drove to our parents' house in a reliable Honda Accord, having sold her Tesla to reduce expenses during her career transition. But she arrived with confidence earned through surviving genuine adversity and building practical skills that would serve her throughout future challenges. Her new position as Chief Compliance Officer at BioSync Technologies offered modest compensation, but provided valuable experience with regulatory requirements and risk management. Charles I brought copies of the quarterly compliance report I prepared for our board of directors. Jessica announced as she entered the dining room. I used analytical techniques you taught me to identify potential problems before they escalate into crisis situations. Her professional transformation reflected deeper changes in how she approached problem-solving and decision-making. Instead of relying on corporate authority and insider optimism, Jessica now emphasized independent verification and conservative risk assessment. The skills that had enabled my investment success were proving valuable for regulatory compliance and operational oversight. My own circumstances had changed dramatically as well. 3 major hedge funds had recruited me to lead forensic analysis teams focused on identifying systematic problems in publicly traded companies. I had accepted a position with Meridian Capital Management, where my research on aggressive accounting practices was protecting institutional investors from companies using financial engineering to mask operational weaknesses. The Megatech analysis has become a case study at Columbia Business School. I mentioned during dinner preparation. Students learn to recognize revenue recognition irregularities and acquisition strategy red flags that can signal fundamental business problems. Emma, who had joined our family celebration as Jessica's close friend, rather than employee, shared updates about ongoing developments in the Megatech investigation. Former executives were facing criminal trials, shareholder lawsuits were proceeding through federal court, and the company itself was struggling to survive after losing most of its institutional investment support. The former chief financial officer received a 4-year prison sentence for securities fraud, Emma reported. Prosecutors proved that he knew acquisition accounting violated generally accepted principles, but continued reporting inflated revenue numbers to maintain stock price momentum. Marcus, who had been quietly observing the conversation, reflected on broader lessons about professional success and personal integrity. This whole experience taught me that apparent achievement can mask serious vulnerabilities, while quiet competence often proves more durable than flashy accomplishments. Tyler and Madison, now 18 and 16 respectively, had been following the story's conclusion while preparing for college and career decisions. Their experience with their aunt's financial crisis had provided practical education about risk management, critical thinking, and the importance of independent analysis over popular opinion. Uncle Charles. I have been reading about forensic accounting techniques and investment analysis, Madison announced. Would you be willing to teach me research methods during winter break? Her request demonstrated genuine interest in analytical thinking, rather than just curiosity about financial success. My parents, who had spent the previous year reevaluating their assumptions about professional achievement and family dynamics, offered observations that highlighted their transformed perspective. We realize now that we emphasized external recognition over analytical competence. Robert admitted. Charles developed skills that protected him from systematic risks, while creating genuine opportunities for helping others. Linda, who had been quietly managing our expanded Thanksgiving preparation, added her own insight about family relationships and mutual support. Crisis revealed everyone's true character and capabilities. Jessica showed courage by acknowledging mistakes and learning new approaches. Charles demonstrated generosity by sharing knowledge rather than exploiting advantages. As we gathered around the same mahogany table where Emma had delivered her shocking news 12 months earlier, the contrast with our previous celebration felt almost surreal. Instead of competitive status displays and condescending commentary, our conversation focused on collaborative problem-solving and shared learning. "I want to propose a toast," Jessica said, raising her wine glass with steady hands. "To Charles, who demonstrated that careful analysis and independent thinking ultimately triumph over corporate authority and popular sentiment. And to families that support each other through difficult transitions while learning from shared challenges." Her words acknowledged the complete reversal of our relationship dynamics while celebrating the deeper bonds that had emerged from crisis and recovery. For the first time in our adult lives, we were functioning as genuine partners rather than competitive siblings. During dessert, Emma shared news that brought symbolic closure to Megatech's collapse. The company announced this morning that it is filing for bankruptcy protection and liquidating remaining assets. Peterson Holdings will recover approximately 15 cents on every dollar of their original investment. The information validated my analysis while highlighting the magnitude of wealth destruction that could result from systematic financial manipulation. Thousands of employees had lost retirement savings, institutional investors had suffered massive losses, and the broader market had become more skeptical of aggressive growth strategies. "Charles, your research network identified similar problems at 3 other companies that have since faced regulatory investigation," Marcus observed. "How many other situations are you currently monitoring?" I explained that forensic analysis had revealed questionable practices at multiple firms across various industries, suggesting that systematic problems extended beyond technology companies, using aggressive acquisition strategies. Markets reward independent thinking and punish groupthink. I concluded. The same analytical principles apply whether you are evaluating investment opportunities, career decisions, or family relationships. As evening turned to night, Jessica asked the question that defined our transformed relationship. "Charles, what advice would you give to young professionals who want to build genuine security rather than pursuing apparent success that might prove illusory?" Her inquiry demonstrated complete acceptance of my expertise, while acknowledging that her previous approach to career development had emphasized external validation over analytical competence and emotional discipline. "Focus on developing skills that remain valuable during difficult transitions," I replied. "Learn to question popular assumptions, follow evidence rather than emotion, and build diversified capabilities that do not depend on single employers or market conditions." Tyler, who had been accepted to several universities for studying economics and finance, asked about specific techniques for independent analysis. "Uncle Charles, how do you distinguish between temporary market fluctuations and systematic problems that signal fundamental business failures?" His question demonstrated sophisticated thinking about risk assessment and analytical methodology. I spent the next hour explaining research frameworks and critical thinking approaches that could serve him throughout his career, regardless of specific professional choices. As our celebration concluded, Emma made an announcement that surprised everyone around the table. "I have been accepted to law school at Georgetown University, where I plan to specialize in securities regulation and corporate compliance." The Megatech experience convinced me that I want to help prevent the kind of systematic deception that destroyed so many people's financial security. Her decision represented another positive outcome from our family's crisis, demonstrating how shared adversity could generate new opportunities and deeper purpose rather than just survival and recovery. I want to thank everyone for including me in your family traditions and supporting me through a very difficult career transition. Emma continued. Working for Jessica taught me valuable lessons about resilience, integrity, and the importance of admitting mistakes while learning from experience. As we prepared to end our transformed Thanksgiving celebration, I reflected on the profound changes that had occurred in our family relationships, professional circumstances, and personal understanding of success and security. Crisis had replaced competition with cooperation, while creating mutual respect based on demonstrated competence rather than assumed hierarchy. The most important lesson from this entire experience is that genuine security comes from analytical thinking and emotional discipline rather than corporate titles or investment concentration. I concluded, independent analysis protects against systematic risks while creating opportunities that conventional wisdom misses. Jessica nodded with understanding earned through surviving genuine adversity and building practical skills. I finally appreciate why you never envied my corporate career or stock option wealth. You recognize that true success requires intellectual honesty and independent judgment rather than insider access and popular approval. Her insight represented complete transformation from the condescending sister who had mocked my analytical approach while concentrating her investments in her employer's stock. Now she understood that my methodical research and contrarian thinking had provided both financial protection and intellectual freedom. As we cleared the dinner table and prepared for another year of family gatherings, I felt genuine satisfaction knowing that crisis had strengthened rather than damaged our relationships, while teaching everyone valuable lessons about risk management, critical thinking, and mutual support. The Megatech collapse had transformed my family's understanding of professional achievement, financial security, and the importance of analytical competence over corporate authority. More importantly, it had created deeper bonds based on shared learning and collaborative problem-solving rather than competitive status displays and individual advancement. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your careful analysis was dismissed by others, only to be proven right when crisis revealed the truth? How do you balance confidence in your own research with respect for different perspectives and approaches to problem-solving? Share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to like this story if it resonated with your own journey of learning to trust analytical thinking over popular opinion. Subscribe for more stories about family dynamics, financial lessons, and the importance of independent judgment in navigating life's challenges. Please share this story with friends and family members who might benefit from understanding how careful research and emotional discipline can protect against systematic risks while creating genuine opportunities for growth and success. Thank you for joining me through this journey of family transformation, financial education, and the discovery that true security comes from analytical competence rather than external validation. May your own investments, career decisions, and family relationships benefit from the kind of independent thinking that turns potential crisis into opportunities for deeper understanding and mutual support.